When we left the courthouse, Jem started to cry. His face was streaked with angry tears as we made our way through the cheerful crowd. "It ain't right," he muttered, all the way to the corner of the square where we found Atticus waiting for us. Atticus was standing under the street light, looking as though nothing had happened. His vest was buttoned, his collar and tie were neatly in place, his watch chain glistened, he was his impassive self again. "It's not right, Atticus," said Jem. "No, son, it's not right. How could they do it? How could they convict Tom if he didn't do it?" "I don't know, son, but they did it. They've done it before, and they did it tonight, and they'll do it again. And when they do it, seems that only children weep." The next morning, Calpurnia showed Atticus that the black community had brought all sorts of food for the Finch family. The kitchen table was loaded with enough food to bury the family. Hunks of salt pork, tomatoes, beans, even scuppernogs. Atticus grinned when he found a jar of pickled pig's knuckles. Calpurnia said, "This was all around the back steps when I got here this morning. They appreciate what you did, Mr. Finch. They aren't overstepping themselves, are they?" Atticus's eyes filled with tears. He did not speak for a moment. "Tell them I'm very grateful," he said. Tell them they must never do this again. Times are too hard." Later that day, Jem, Dill, and I went over to talk to Miss Bonnie about everything. She said, "You'd be surprised how many people care about Tom. Judge Taylor cares, for example. Did it ever strike you that Judge Taylor naming Atticus to defend that boy was no accident? That Judge Taylor might have had his reason for naming him?" Miss Bonnie had a good point. Usually Maxwell Green is the lawyer to do these kinds of trials, but he's not very good. So Judge Taylor must have appointed Atticus because he wanted Tom to have a good defense and a fair trial. When we got home, Aunt Alexandra came to the door and called us, but she was too late. It was Miss Stephanie's pleasure to tell us this morning Mr. Bob Ewell stopped Atticus on the post office corner, spat in his face, and told him he'd get him if it took him the rest of his life.
"I wish Bob Ewell wouldn't chew tobacco," was all Atticus said about it. According to Miss Stephanie Crawford, however, Atticus was leaving the post office when Mr. Ewell approached him, cursed him, spat on him, and threatened to kill him. Miss Stephanie said Atticus didn't bat an eye, just took out his handkerchief, wiped his face, and stood there and let Mr. Ewell call him names wild horses could not bring her to repeat. "So," Mr. Ewell said, "too proud to fight you, lovin'?" And Atticus replied, "No, too old," put his hands in his pockets, and strolled on. A few days later, Atticus noticed that Jem and I were really worried because Bob Ewell had threatened to kill Atticus. He told Jem, "Jem, see if you can stand in Bob Ewell's shoes a minute. I destroyed his last shred of credibility at that trial, if he even had any to begin with. The man had to have some kind of comeback. His kind always does. So by spitting in my face and threatening me saved my Ella Ewell one last beating, that's something I'll gladly take. He had to take it out on somebody, and I'd rather it be me than a house full of children out there. You understand?" After that, we were not afraid. Atticus also told us that nothing would happen to Tom Robinson until after the higher court reviewed his case, and that Tom had a good chance of going free, or at least having a new trial. It was at Enfield Prison Farm, 70 miles away from Chester County. I asked Atticus if Tom's wife and children were allowed to visit him, but Atticus said no. "If he loses his appeal," I asked one evening, "what'll happen to him?" "He'll go to the electric chair," said Atticus, "unless the governor commutes his sentence. No time to worry yet, Scout. We've got a good chance." "Tom's jury sure made up its mind in a hurry," Jim muttered. Atticus' fingers went to his watch pocket. "No, it didn't," he said, more to himself than to us. That was the one thing that made me think, well, this may be the shadow of a new beginning. That jury took it a few hours. An inevitable verdict, maybe, but usually it takes them just a few minutes. You might like to know that there was one fellow who took considerable wearing down in the beginning. He was wanted to set Tom free. "Who?" Jim was astonished. Atticus' eyes twinkled. "It's not fair for me to say, but I'll tell you this much. He was one of your old Sarum friends." "One of the Cunninghams?" Jim yelped. I didn't recognize any of them. You're joking." "One of their connections. On a hunch, I didn't dismiss him from the jury, even though I could have." "Golly Moses," Jim said reverently. "One minute they're trying to kill Tom, and the next they're running him loose. I'll never understand those folks as long as I live." After Atticus left the room, I decided that it would be nice to Walter Cunningham now on, since someone in his family had been on the jury and wanted to set Tom free. I even said that I would invite him over and spend the night sometime. "We'll see about that," Aunt Alexandra said. Surprised, I turned to him. "Why not, Auntie? They're good folks." She looked over at me over her sewing glasses. "Jean Louise, there's no doubt in my mind that they're good folks. But they're not our kind of folks. You can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines, you can put him in a shoe and a new suit, but he'll never be like Jem. Besides, there's a drinking streak in the family a mile wide. Finch women aren't interested in that sort of people. If they're good folks, then why can't I be nice to Walter? I didn't say not to be nice to him. You should be friendly and polite to him. You should be gracious to everybody, dear. But you don't have to invite him home. I want to play with Walter, Auntie. Why can't I? She took off her glasses and stared at me. I'll tell you why, she said. Because he is trash. That's why you can't play with him. I'll not have you around him, picking up his habits and learning Lord knows what. You're enough of a problem to your father as it is. I was so angry and upset, but Jem put his arm around me and led me, sobbing in fury, to his room. He told me that Auntie was trying to make me a lady and told me I should take up sewing or something. I told Jem I was upset that Auntie called Walter Cunningham trash. But Walter isn't trash. He ain't like the Yules, I told Jem. You know something, Scout? I've got it all figured out now. I've got it a lot lately, and I've got it figured out. There are 4 kinds of folks in this world. There's the ordinary, kind like us, and the neighbors, there's kind of like the Cunninghams out in the woods, they're kind like the Yules down in the dump, and the Negroes. Our kind of folks don't like the Cunninghams. The Cunninghams don't like the Yules. The Yules hate and despise the colored folks. Background means that a family has been reading and writing for a long time. I don't think that's what background is, Jem. Everybody's got to learn. Nobody's born knowing. The Walter's as smart as he can be. He just got held back sometimes because he has to stay out and help his daddy. Nothing's wrong with him. Nah, Jem. I think he's just one of a kind, folks. Jem said, that's what I thought too when I was your age. If there's just one kind of folks, why can't they get along together? If they're all alike, why do they go out of their way to despise each other? Scout, I think I'm beginning to understand something. I think I'm beginning to understand why Boo Radley stayed shut up in his house the whole time. It's because he wants to stay inside.
It was on the brink of September, and Dill would be leaving tomorrow. He was off swimming with Jem. They said they were going in naked, and I couldn't come, so I divided my time between Calpurnia and Miss Maudie. Today, Aunt Alexandra was having the ladies over. After they talked, they were going to have refreshments. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments. I didn't know if I should go into the dining room or stay out. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat. Since Auntie let Calpurnia serve them today, I thought if I spilled something on my dress, Calpurnia would have to wash it before tomorrow. I didn't want to give her any more work today. "Can I help you, Cal?" I asked, wishing to be of some service. "You can be still as a mouse in that corner," she said. "And you can help me load up the trays when I come back." I helped Calpurnia carry in the coffee pot and did not spill a thing. Aunt Alexandra smiled brilliantly. "Stay with us, Jean Louise," she said. This was all her campaign to teach me to be a lady. I sat next to Miss Maudie. I tightly gripped the sides of the chair and waited for someone to speak to me. "You're mighty dressed up, Miss Jean Louise," Miss Maudie said. "Where are your breeches today?" "Under my dress." I hadn't meant it to be funny, but the ladies laughed. My cheeks grew hot as I realized my mistake, but Miss Maudie looked gravely down at me. She never laughed at me unless I meant it to be funny. Miss Stephanie Crawford called from across the room, "What you going to be when you grow up, Miss Jean Louise? A lawyer?" I said no, but I hadn't really thought about it. I asked Miss Merriweather, who was sitting to my right, about what they had been talking about before I came in. She filled me in on how she had been out to visit a family who was living in sin and squalor. She told me how fortunate I was to live in a good Christian family with Christian folks in a Christian town. The conversation then turned toward Tom Robinson's wife. Miss Merriweather continued, "There's one thing I truly believe, Gertrude," she continued, "but some people just don't see it my way. If we just let them know we forgive them, that we've forgotten it, then this whole thing will blow over." Miss Merriweather," I interrupted once more. "What'll blow over?" "Nothing, Jean Louise," she said. "The cooks and field hands are just dissatisfied, but they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after the trial." She paused and turned to another woman in the group. "Gertrude, I tell you there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their mouths go down to here. Just ruins your day to have one of them in your kitchen." Another lady said, "Looks like we're fighting a losing battle. It doesn't matter to 'em one bit. We can educate 'em till we're blue in the face. We can try till we drop to make Christians out of 'em, but there's no lady safe in her bed these nights." I had lost interest in the conversation when they quit talking about Tom Robinson's wife. Miss Merriweather spoke up again. Northerns are hypocrites. At least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there set him free, but you don't see him sitting at the table with them. At least we don't have the deceit to say to him, yes, you're as good as we are, but stay away from us. Down here, we just say, you live your way and we'll live ours. I think that woman, Miss Roosevelt's lost her mind. Just plain lost her mind coming down to Birmingham and trying to sit with them. If I was the mayor of Birmingham, I was thinking if I was the governor of Alabama, I'd let Tom Robinson go so quick. I heard Calpurnia talking about how bad it was going for Tom. He said that there wasn't a thing Atticus could do to make being shut up easier for him. The last thing he had said to Atticus the day before he was taken to the prison camp was, "Goodbye, Mr. Finch. There ain't nothing you can do now, so there ain't no use trying." He had just given up hope. Atticus came in the door, and his face was white. He apologized for the interruption and asked if he could speak with Alexandra. He wanted to borrow Calpurnia for a while. "Cal," Atticus said, "I want you to go with me out to Helen Robinson's house." "What's the matter?" Aunt Alexandra said, alarmed by the look on my father's face. "Tom's dead." Aunt Alexandra put her hand to her mouth. "They shot him," said Atticus. "He was running. It was during their exercise period. They said he just broke out into a blind raving charge at the fence and started climbing over, right in front of them." "Didn't they try to stop him? Didn't they give him any warning?" Aunt Alexandra's voice shook. "Oh yes, the guards called to him to stop. They fired a few shots in the air, then to kill. They got him just as he went over the fence. They said if he'd had 2 good arms, he'd have made it. He was moving so fast. 17 bullet holes in him. They didn't have to shoot him that much. Cal, I want you to come with me and help me tell Helen." "Yes, sir," she murmured, fumbling with her apron. Miss Maudie went to Calpurnia and untied it. "This is the last straw, Atticus," Aunt Alexandra said. "Depends on how you look at it," he said. "What was one Negro, more or less, among 200 of them? He wasn't Tom to them. He was an escaping prisoner. We had a good chance," he said. "I told him what I thought, but I couldn't in truth say that we had more than a good chance. I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. Ready, Cal?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Finch." "Then let's go." Aunt Alexandra sat down in the chair and put her hands to her face. I thought she was crying. When she took her hands away, she wasn't, but she looked weary. I heard Miss Maudie breathing heavily and heard the ladies in the other room chatting happily. "I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie, but he's my brother, and I just want him to know when this will ever end. It tears him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears him to pieces." "I've seen him when. What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else?" "What else does who want, Alexandra?" Miss Maudie asked. "I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do. Be quiet, they'll hear you," said Miss Maudie. "Have you ever thought of it this way, Alexandra? Whether Maycomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay a man. We trust him to do right. It's that simple." "Who?" "The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. The handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people with enough humility to think when they look at a Negro, they're but for the Lord's kindness am I. The handful of people in this town with background, that's who they are." I was shaking, and Miss Maudie told me to stop, and she also told Aunt Alexandra to get up because we had left the ladies too long already. "Are you together again, Jean Louise?" Miss Maudie asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's join the ladies." We all went in, and Aunt Alexandra refilled coffee cups and dished out goodies. The conversation resumed with the Christian works they had done. Aunt Alexandra looked across the room at me and smiled. She looked at a tray of cookies on the table and nodded at them. I carefully picked up the tray and watched myself walk to Miss Merriweather. With my best company manners, I asked her if she would have some. After all, if Auntie could be a lady at a time like this, so could I.
September had come, but not a trace of cool weather with it, and we were still sleeping on the back porch. A roly-poly insect had crawled onto the porch. Jem was scowling when I went to mash it. This was probably a part of the stage he was going through, and I wished he would hurry up and get through it. "Why couldn't I mash it?" I asked. "Because they don't bother you," Jem answered in the darkness. "Reckon you're at a stage now where you don't kill flies and mosquitoes now." "I reckon," I said. "Let me know when you change your mind. Tell you one thing, though. I ain't gonna sit around and not scratch a red bug." "Aw, dry up," he answered drowsily. Jem was the one who was getting more like a girl every day, not I. I was thinking of Dill. He had left us on the first of the month, saying he would be back by the minute school was out. Dill told me of the time he and Jem were swimming out. On the way back, they saw Atticus driving up the road. He stopped and Jem pleaded for a ride. Atticus finally agreed. He and Calpurnia were on their way to Tom Robinson's place. They turned off the highway, rode slowly by Dump and past the Ewell residence, down the narrow lane to the Negro cabins. Dill said a crowd of black children were playing marbles in Tom's front yard. Atticus parked the car and got out. Calpurnia followed him through the front gate. Dill heard him ask one of the children, "Where's your mother, Sam?" and heard Sam say, "She's down at Sis Stevens, Mr. Fitch. Want me to run and fetch her?" Dill said Atticus looked uncertain, then he said yes, and Sam scampered off. "Go on with your game, boys," Atticus said to the children. A little girl came to the door, and she needed some help getting up the steps. Dill said that Atticus offered his finger to help her, and then gave her over to Calpurnia. Sam was trotting behind his mother when they came up. Dill said Helen said, "Evening, Mr. Fitch. Won't you have a seat?" But she didn't say anything anymore. Neither did Atticus. "Scout," said Dill. "She just fell down in the dirt. Just fell down in the dirt like a giant with a big foot. Just came along and stepped on her. Just Dill's fat foot hit the ground, like he'd step on an ant. Dill and Calpurnia said Atticus lifted Helen to her feet and carried her halfway to the cabin. They stayed inside a long time, and Atticus came along. When they drove back by the dump, some of the Ewells hollered at them, but Dill didn't catch what they said. Maycomb was interested by the news of Tom's death for perhaps 2 days. To Maycomb, Tom's death was typical. Typical for to cut and run. Typical for a mentality to have no plan, no thought for the future. Just run blind first chance he saw. Funny thing, Atticus Finch might have got him off scot-free. But wait, hell no. You know how they are. Easy come, easy go. Just shows that Robinson was legally married. They said he kept himself clean, went to church and all that. But when it comes down to the line, the always comes out and get him. The Macon Tribune appeared the following Thursday. There's a brief obituary, but there's also an editorial. Mr. Underwood was at this most bitter, and he couldn't care less who canceled advertising subscriptions as a result of his editorial. He didn't write about the injustices. He was writing that the children could understand. Mr. Underwood completely figured it was a sin to kill cripples, be they standing, sitting, or escaping. He likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. How could this be so? I wondered as real Mr. Underwood's editorial. Senseless killing. Tom had been given due process of law to the day of his death. He had been tried openly. Convicted by 12 good men and true. My father had fought for him all the way. Then Mr. Underwood's meaning became clear. Atticus had used every tool available to free men to save Tom Robinson. But in the secret courts of men's hearts, Atticus had no case. Tom was a dead man. The minute Mayella Ewell opened her mouth and screamed. The name Ewell gave me a queasy feeling. Mr. Ewell said it made one down and about 2 more to go. Jem told me not to be afraid. Mr. Ewell was more than hot gas to anything. Jem also told me that if I breathed the word to Atticus, if any way I let Atticus know, I knew Jem would personally never speak to me again. School started, and so did our daily trips past the Radley house. Jem was in the 7th grade now and went into high school, beyond the grammar school building. I was now in 3rd grade, and our routines were so differently I only walked to school with Jem in the mornings and saw him at mealtimes. The Radley place didn't terrify me anymore. I sometimes felt a bit remorse when passing the old place, at ever having taken part in having such sheer torment to Arthur Radley. What reasonable recluse wants children peeping through his shutters, delivering greetings on the end of a fishing pole, wandering his collards at night? And yet I remembered 2 Indian head pennies, chewing gum, soap dolls, a rusty medal, a broken watch and chain. Jem must have put them away somewhere. I stopped and looked at the tree in the afternoon. The trunk was swelling around a cement patch. The patch itself was turning yellow. I still looked for Boo each time I went by. Maybe someday we would see him. I imagined how it would be when it happened. He'd just be sitting on the swing when I came along. "How do you do, Mr. Arthur?" I would say, as if I had seen him every afternoon of my life. "Evening, Jean Louise," he would say, as if he had said it every afternoon of my life. "Right pretty spell we're having, isn't it?" Yes, sir, right pretty," I would say, and go on. It was only a fantasy, though. We would never see him. One night when I told Atticus that I wanted to see Boo Radley again, he said, "Don't start with that again, Scout. I'm too old to go chasing after you off the Boo Radley property. Besides, it's dangerous. You might get shot, you know. Mr. Nason shoots every shadow he sees, even shadows that leave 4-size bare footprints. You were lucky not to be killed." I couldn't believe it. Atticus knew it was us that Mr. Radley shot that night. This was the first time that he had let us to know that he knew a lot more of something than we thought he knew. One day in school, Cecile Jacobs presented a current event about Adolf Hitler. He presented the news article to the class. Adolf Hitler has been after the Jews, and he's putting them in prisons, and he's taken away all their property, and he won't let any of them out of the country. A student in the back of the room said, "How can he do that?" "Who do what?" said Miss Gase, our teacher, patiently. "I mean, how can Hitler put all these folks in a pen like that? Looks like the government stopped him," said the student. "Hitler is the government," said Miss Gates. She went to the blackboard and printed the word democracy in large letters. "Democracy," she said. "Does anybody have a definition?" I raised my hand and said, "Equal rights for all, special privileges for none." "Very good, Jean Louise, very good," Miss Gates smiled. In front of democracy, she printed, "We are a." Now, class, say it all together. We are a democracy. We are a democracy, and Germany is a dictatorship. Over there, we don't believe in persecuting anybody. Persecution comes from the people who are prejudiced. Prejudice, she said carefully. There are no better people in the world than the Jews, and why Hitler doesn't think so is a mystery to me. I went home later that day and asked Atticus if it was okay to hate Hitler. "It's not," he said. "It's not okay to hate anybody." I was still confused about things, so when I went to see Jem, I said, "Jem's coming out of the courthouse that night Miss Gates was. She was going down the steps in front of us." Must not have seen her. She was talking with Miss Stephanie Crawford. I heard her say it sometimes taught them a lesson. They were getting way above themselves, and the next thing that they can do is marry us. She was talking about black folks. "Jem, how can she say she hates Hitler so bad and then turn around and be ugly to the folks right here at home?" Jem was suddenly furious. He leaped off the bed and grabbed me by my collar and shook me. "I never want to hear about that courthouse again. Ever, ever, ever. You hear me? You hear me? Now, don't you ever say one word about it to me again. Now go on." I was too surprised to cry. I crept from Jem's room and shut the door softly. I found Atticus and tried to climb up in his lap. Atticus smiled. You're getting so big now. I'll just have to hold a part of you." He let me close. "Scout," he said softly, "don't let Jem get you down. He's having a rough time these days. I heard you back there." Atticus said that Jem was trying hard to forget all the prejudice and injustice he saw at Tom's trial. After enough time passed, Jem would be able to make sense of it all and sort things out, but right now he was very upset.
Something weird happened to Judge Taylor one Sunday night. He was lost in a book when he noticed a scratching noise. "Hush," he said to Ann Taylor, his fat dog. Then he realized he was speaking to an empty room. The scratching noise was coming from the rear of his house. Judge Taylor clumped to the back porch and let Ann out and found the screen door swinging open. A shadow in the corner of the house caught his eyes, and that was all he saw of the visitor. Mrs. Taylor came home from church to find her husband in his chair, lost in the writing of Bob Taylor, with a shotgun across his lap. I bet that his visitor was Bob Ewell, who was mad at him because he appointed Atticus to Tom's case, which meant the judge wanted Tom to have a fair chance. Something happened to Helen Robinson, too. Mr. Link Diaz, who had been Tom's boss, created a job for Helen because he felt so badly about what happened to Tom. Helen had to walk nearly a mile out of her way to work in order to avoid the Ewells' place. The Ewells would swear at her if she tried to use the public road that ran past their house. When Link Diaz realized that Helen was coming the long way to work, he asked her why. He got very mad and went to the Ewells' house. He yelled at Bob Ewell that he would have him arrested if he kept bothering Helen, but Bob Ewell kept annoying her. He would follow behind her, saying foul, evil things. Link Diaz threatened again to have him arrested, and eventually he stopped bothering her. Halloween was approaching, and this year we were having a pageant. Miss Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant, and I was going to be a ham. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the country's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed up to look like a cow, Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, another child would be a peanut, and on down the line. Our only duties, as far as I could gather from our 2 rehearsals, were to enter from stage left as Miss Merriweather identified us. When she called out, "Pork," that was my cue. A few hours before the pageant, I practiced my part for Calpurnia in the kitchen, and she said I was wonderful. I wanted to go across the street to show Miss Maudie, but Jem said she'd probably be at the pageant anyway. After that, it didn't matter whether we went or not. Jem said he would take me, thus began our longest journey together.
The weather was warm, the wind was growing stronger, and there was no moon. As we walked, Jem and I talked about ghosts. We were near the Radley lot. I was getting scared anyway when someone suddenly leaped out at us. "God almighty," Jem yelled. Cecile Jacobs shrieked, "Ha, gotcha!" He was mighty proud of himself, and he told us so as we walked the rest of the way to the school. The auditorium was filling up with people, and backstage there were people with all sorts of costumes. I had some time before I had to be on stage, so I curled up my knees and sank down in my costume to rest. Well, I fell asleep listening to Mrs. Merriweather's long speech about Maycomb's grand history. I woke up suddenly to her shrieking, "Pork!" and toddled as fast as I could on stage. Apparently I was too late because she had already called a few times. She was mad at me for ruining her pageant. Judge Taylor liked it though, and the audience cheered loudly for me. I was so embarrassed that I didn't want to leave right away, so we waited for most people to leave, then we began walking home. It was even darker out. Jem was guiding me along since I still had my ham costume on. At one point, he squeezed the top of my costume so hard. "Ah, Jem! Hush up, Scout. What you doing?" "Thought I heard something," he whispered. We stopped and listened. It was probably old Cecile again trying to scare us. "It's not that. I hear when we are walking along." "Are you afraid?" I asked. "No. Think we're almost to the tree. Be real quiet." It's difficult to walk in my costume, and we couldn't see anything. I could hear someone shuffling and someone's pants rustling behind us. Jem was holding on to me. We stopped again and listened as someone was running toward us. "Run, Scout, run!" Something crushed me in my costume, and I fell to the ground. I was on the ground floundering around. I could hear scuffling, kicking sounds, and scraping. Somebody rolled against me. There was more scuffling, and then Jem screamed. The scuffling noises were dying. I heard someone wheezing. I heard someone moving, so I asked Jem. It seemed like someone else was under the tree now. I fell around and somebody was lying there. I began walking towards the road, and I could see a man walking towards my house, carrying Jem. "Call Dr. Reynolds," Atticus said sharply. "Where's Scout?" "Here she is," Alexandra called, pulling me towards her, working me free of my mangled costume. Then Atticus called the sheriff, Heck Tate. "Is Jem dead?" I asked Aunt Alexandra. No, darling, he's unconscious." "What happened?" "I don't know." She left it at that and brought me some overalls to put on. When Dr. Reynolds arrived, it took him 10 forevers to finish checking on Jem. Then I asked him, Is Jem dead?" "Far from it," he talked, while looking me over to make sure I was okay. "He's got a bump on his head, just like yours, and a broken arm. Looks like someone tried to wring his arm off. We can't do much tonight, except try to make him comfortable." You don't feel anywhere, do you?" I smiled. "Go have a look at him." By then, Mr. Tate was there, so we all went in together. Jem was lying on his back. There was an ugly mark along one side of his face. His left arm lay out from his body. "Jem?" Atticus said. "Let's not bother him. He needs rest." I retreated from his bed. Aunt Alexandra was in the rocking chair. Mr. Tate stood in the doorway. The man who brought Jem was in the corner. "Heck, did you find anything out there?" Atticus said. "Sit down, Mr. Finch," he said pleasantly. "I found Scout's dress, some funny pieces of muddy cloth," he paused, "and I found Bob Ewell on the ground. He's dead, Mr. Finch."
Aunt Alexandra stood right up and gasped. "Are you sure?" Atticus said weakly. "He won't hurt these children again," Mr. Tate said. He turned to me. "Scout, can you tell us what happened out there? Did you see him following you?" We started home. It was dark. Jem said, "Hush a minute. We thought it was Cecil Jacobs. He scared us once tonight." I could hear the footsteps too then. They walked when we walked and stopped when we stopped. When we got under the tree, all of a sudden something grabbed me and mashed my costume. I heard them tussling. Jem grabbed me and pulled me toward the road. Mr. Ewell yanked him down. Then there was a noise. Jem hollered. Mr. Ewell was trying to squeeze me to death, I reckon. Then somebody yanked Mr. Ewell down. Jem must have gotten up. Somebody was staggering around and coughing. I thought it was Jem, but it was him. I half pointed to the man in the corner. His arms were folded across his chest. He had sickly white hands that had never seen the sun. His face was white too. His cheeks were thin. His gray eyes were so colorless I thought he was blind. I gazed at him in wonder, and his lips parted into a timid smile. Our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. "Hey, Boo," I said. "Mr. Arthur, honey," Atticus corrected me. He then suggested that we go out on the porch. I led Boo to a chair. Atticus rubbed his head and said, "Well, heck, it was a clear-cut self-defense. Jem is almost 13, but it will go to a trial in county court." "Mr. Finch, Jem did not stab Bob Yule," said Heck Tate. "Bob Yule fell on his knife. He killed himself." Atticus looked like he didn't believe Mr. Tate. Mr. Tate kept glancing at Boo. They went back and forth a few times, and they seemed to disagree. Mr. Tate told Atticus that if he told the town exactly what happened tonight, the whole town would talk about it, and all the women would want to bring Boo cakes for helping Jem and me. To take the one man who's done you and this town a service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight is a sin. Mr. Tate stomped off the porch, and Atticus slowly turned toward me. "Scout, Mr. Yule fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand?" I hugged him and said, "Yes, sir. Mr. Tate was right. It'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird." Atticus rubbed my head and then walked across the porch to Boo. "Thank you for my children, Arthur." Boo Radley shuffled to his feet. He made uncertain moves. I took him to see Jem one last time. He leaned forward, and an expression of curiosity was on his face, as though he had never seen a boy before. His hand came down lightly on Jem's hair. "Will you take me home?" he whispered. I took his arm so that it looked like he was escorting me like a lady down the walk. When we got to his door, he gently released my hand, opened the door, and went inside. I never saw him again. I turned around on his front porch and looked at the neighborhood from Boo's view. I thought about all the things he might have seen. Dill, Jem, and I getting scolded for playing near his yard, the night of the fire, Atticus shooting the dog. He had been with us through all of it. Atticus said you never really knew a man until you stand in his shoes. He was right. As I walked home, I thought about all that Jem and I had learned. There wasn't much left, except maybe algebra. Atticus was sitting up, reading in Jem's room. I asked if I could sit with him, and he agreed. He was reading a book, so I asked him to read it aloud. I was falling asleep, so he took me to my room. I told him the story was good, but the man in the story was misunderstood. People thought he was bad, but when they finally saw him, he hadn't done anything. He was really nice. Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. He tucked the covers under my chin, turned out the light, and went into Jem's room. He would be there all night, and when Jem woke up in the next morning.